I'm just curious, Christina, when you were doing this training, what happened perceptually to you? Did you notice things happen when you could tune in on those frequencies?
Some people will notice things, some people will not. So like I've trained people who, one guy that I was working with said it was literally felt as if he was coming back into his body. Or maybe people will feel like an interesting sensation, like I've heard people say it's like an itch was scratched on the inside of my head, or like some people may feel a pressure.
I have felt. I watched this graph, and when the three lines come close or cross, it feels like my brain is being squeezed, like my skull is being squeezed, and I'm always very exhausted after a session.
And that's a really common thing too, because we think the brain's working pretty hard. Most of the people that I work with, they're pretty tired after their sessions. Yeah.
I know you said that you were pretty skeptical of this when you came into it, and you're in the process of a clinical study to test, to scientifically kind of test it. Can you just talk about that at all?
Sure, I can definitely talk about that. So I came from Emory University, and it's very scientifically oriented, and psychology is a humanistic science, and we're relying on people's perceptions, and so we're not measuring like barometric pressure or that kind of thing. So it's not a hard science, but it really wants to be, and so that's where I was coming from. Everything's got to be evidence based, and so I'm coming out of there. And so in the research world, neurofeedback, as Rodney Dangerfield says, it don't get no respect. A lot of people dismiss it out of hand. And we'll say, oh, well, it's all hooey, you're not really doing anything. And it's true that more research needs to be done, but in my process of coming into it, I was like, oh, there's not a lot of research on this. I'm very skeptical that this could actually do anything for anybody. But in my process of setting up this study and running this study, I now have data to say, this works. And more than that, in working with individuals and seeing how profoundly it has changed people's lives, I know that there's something going on, and it makes sense that the brain is a neuroplastic organ. It can change itself, and it makes sense that we can help it to change by giving it feedback. So does that answer your question?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Are the beeps feedback?
Yes.
How does that work?
It's like a game of, like that children's game, hot or cold, when something's hidden. So like, take this for example. Someone has hidden a $5,000 check somewhere in this building, and you have a half an hour to find it, right? It's going to be pretty difficult to do if you're just blindly looking around. But if someone's saying, you're getting warmer, you're going to find that check pretty quickly, right? And so that's what the beep is. The beep is telling the brain, you're getting warmer. And when the beep stops, it's telling the brain, you're getting cold. So that's feedback for you right there.
Does the frequency change as it's going? Like if you're getting
Right,
warmer,
so-
it's closer together?
Right, so what we do, how we set up the neurofeedback is, mostly what we do is what's called SMR training, which stands for sensory motor rhythm. And I won't get into the total specifics of that, but in general, we want the brain to be more in that mid-range. So we will set certain frequencies that we want to reward and certain frequencies that we want to inhibit. So in general, there's 4 to 7, which would be called theta waves. Those are slower waves, and they're more associated with being in a trance-like state, almost going to sleep, that kind of thing. And we generally inhibit that because as other activity comes down, that one has a tendency to go up, and we don't want it to. So what that means is, so let's say 4 to 7 is our range. That's the frequency, or that's the frequency range that we're going to work with. All right. So in the computer program, I'll set 4 to 7 at the start of a session, and then I'll hook the person up, get what the amplitude is of their brain at that moment, right? Or averaged over 30 seconds. and then say, and I'll set a threshold. And that threshold will be based on, so let's say, at that given moment, the amplitude is, because the amplitude is changing, it's variable. The amplitude is under it maybe 30% of the time, right? So that's where the threshold will be. So then the computer will only beep during the times where the amplitude is that small. When the amplitude gets bigger, the computer will stop beeping. So it's basically shaping, it's operant conditions shaping the brainwave to get smaller over time. So it's a lot like exercise. It takes practice, and the more you practice, the better the brain gets at it. And the reverse is true for rewarding a frequency. So like, if we want the brain to make more of something over time, we'll say, okay, it's over this threshold, maybe 65% of the time at that moment. So then we'll set that threshold at a certain amplitude, and then when the brainwave is over that threshold, the computer will continue to beep. If it falls under it, the beeps stop. And so it's just telling the brain, okay, make more of that. Yeah. I don't know I'll go there.
I've been through some traumatic experiences, and it kind of felt like my brain was sort of snapping into place. And thinking about an event was almost like a cramp. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if you've done any correlation between the thinking pattern of reviewing, circumstances as you try to make them make sense when they don't make sense, and if that incidences of going back over things lessons when the brain kind of does what you are trying to get it to do. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me give you an example of that, and hopefully this will address what you're getting. So in the research study, I was working with a gentleman in his 60s, and he had experienced a lot of abuse, including a lot of sexual abuse when he was a kid. And these are memories that he had really just kept out of his awareness, just tried to block them out as best he could. He had a lot of problems in his life, but during the course of the training, we had a set protocol, and we still do have a set protocol that we use. And so we adjust the reward frequency. We don't adjust the inhibits, for reasons I won't go into, but we adjust the reward frequency. And our standard procedure is to, we start at one level. If that's not helpful to him, we lower it, lower it, lower it until it's helpful. So with this particular guy, I started lowering it, and he reported being flooded by memories of what happened. He was waking up thinking about what happened. He was crying all the time. And so I said, uh-oh, what's going on here? So I went up in frequency. And I went up to higher than where we started. And he said, it's the weirdest thing. These memories they faded away. I tell me, I'm just sitting here looking at this computer screen, listening to it beep. I'm trying to prove it wrong, so I keep trying to think about these things, but it doesn't stick. So does that kind of get at what you're talking about? That this training, it can really affect how these memories are coming, whether you're ruminating on them, whether they keep coming back, or whether they're not.
So you're saying that he was unable to keep the memories in his mind when he was hitting those waves the way you were targeting?
Well, no, so just in the course of the training, when we raised our frequency, he could remember the stuff, but it wasn't flooding him. They weren't sticking. He could put it out of his mind when he wanted to. When he could call it up, and it didn't have the same emotional power over him. It was just he could put it back again and just go on to doing something else.
That's interesting.
For some applications of the arts, you might check out. There's some work done by a guy named David Rosenboom, who put those sensors on a dancer. There was actually it was a martial art. It was a sword dancer, and used the values to control electronic instruments, and that's quite old. Actually, it was probably in the 70s that he did that work.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work too with peak performance for athletes, helping them to be able to focus. An example would be basketball players. They need to be able to shift their amount of focus. So when they're looking down the court, they need to have a wide focus to take in the whole court. But when they're on the free throw line and the crowd's cheering, they need to be able to focus in just on that. And so there's people that really do a lot of training helping with that. With the arts too, people look at musicians and what's going on with music. And one thing that I was actually saw today when I was doing a little research was if you've ever heard about this idea that listening to Mozart as you study for a test will improve your performance. They actually think that has something to do with the rhythm of the music meshing up with the rhythm of your brain.
It's also really symmetrical.
Yes, which probably helps the rhythm of the brain. Yeah.
So I was wondering, actually, to follow up on that, I was wondering if movement or exercise plays any role in the kind of feedback work that you do.
Not me personally, but we do at the center. Movement and exercise are big things that we're into as well. To give you an example, yoga is a really powerful self-regulatory practice. That we have an ongoing yoga class, and we are actually doing a research study on yoga to help people regulate themselves as well. And so one of the things we're wanting to do is look at, okay, how does yoga really change the brain? And so that's one of the directions we're gonna be going in. Yeah.
Would any of this work have any implications for memory loss?
Yes, actually it does. To give an example of it, I'm not familiar with the research, but my supervisors have told me that you can do neurofeedback training with people who have Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, and you can actually improve their functioning up to a point. Those diseases are, unfortunately, they will keep going, and you can't cure Alzheimer's or dementia, but you can really help with memory and that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, there's some folks over here.
You had mentioned earlier about other methods of treating PTSD done in VA or whatever. What are the problems with those methods, and why do you think that this is a better method?
I don't necessarily think it's a better method for everyone. What all of the methods that I mentioned that go on at the VA, prolonged exposure, cognitive processing, that kind of thing, they're all about exposure. So the model that they use is that there was this traumatic experience, and that you're reactive to triggers of it. So to go into a little bit more depth, there's brain systems they think are involved is the amygdala, which is this emotional memory, and that you haven't really integrated into your cognitive memory. And so basically, what they do is you keep going back over and over and over the memory, much like you would with any sort of anxiety thing. Like if you want to cure a phobia, you just keep doing it until the anxiety goes away. Well, you keep going over these memories until the anxiety goes away. And that's what they do, right? But like I said, we work with kids who have experienced trauma as the norm of their life, and they've experienced it in a developmental context. You can't really do that because there's not one trauma, and there's not one thing that they can focus on. Plus that's a top-down approach. You need the verbal capacity in order to talk about the memory. If you don't have that verbal capacity, you can't engage in the treatment. And so we're interested in more of a holistic approach on how trauma really affects the body and how there's an interrelationship between the brain and the body that these exposure therapies don't quite get. Which isn't to say they don't work. I mean, they do work for some people, just not for everybody.